אתם מאזינים לגלי צה"ל, שידורי צבא הגנה לישראל. דובר צה"ל מודיע כי היום, סמוך לשעה 2 בצהריים, פתחו הכוחות המצריים והסוריים בהתקפה בסיני וברמת הגולן, וכוחותינו פועלים נגד התוקפים. כתבינו מוסרים כי בשל פעולות של מטוסים סוריים בגזרת רמת הגולן, נשמעות ברחבי הארץ צפירות עולות ויורדות. אלה הן צפירות אמת.
סיר בשר, סיר בשר.
إن القوات المسلحة المصرية قامت بمعجزة على أي مقياس عسكري.
شمسك وقمر جاري About 6 o'clock, I told my people, my forces, felicitations. The Israelis has lost their balance.
Sadat's armies drove the Israelis from the Suez Canal. Israel's Air Force tried to retaliate, but failed to break through Egypt's missile cover.
I remember coming to the canal when I arrived in my division after 24 hours of going without tanks across the desert on chains. I saw a young officer. He said, he looked at me, was like that. As he could not believe, he said, we cannot stop them. We cannot stop them. Our forces, for the first time, suddenly felt that they cannot stop the Egyptians.
The morale was so high of everyone, even who lost his sight, even who was with amputated legs, but very happy that he has done something for his country.
The Egyptians advanced 8 miles into the Sinai and then stopped as planned. In the north, Syria's attack also caught Israel off balance. 600 Syrian tanks rolled over Israel's defenses and across the Golan Heights.
We weren't ready today. We came from the home in the middle of Yom Kippur.
So who was here? That was regular soldiers?
Yes, only the regular.
So they must have had a hard time.
Oh yeah, very hard.
Did you have many casualties?
Well, with such things we don't know. It's not allowed to talk about them.
The Syrians were expected to press their advantage.
We must keep on fighting with all our courage, faith, and trust, as a nation that knows we're fighting for our lives. And we are fighting for our lives.
Now the war began to swing Israel's way. In 3 hours, 250 Egyptian tanks were destroyed. But Egypt still had 2 armies in the Sinai. The Israelis planned a daring coup. They set out to cut through the gap in the Egyptian lines, create a bridgehead over the canal, and sweep around to isolate the Egyptian Third Army. The architect of the plan was General Ariel Sharon.
We slipped through the Egyptian lines without major problems. But when we reached the canal, there was a ferocious battle.
It was a terrible night. I think that night we lost, from my division, about 300 killed and around 1,000 wounded. And all of us, from soldiers to the divisional commander, we all were fighting there. It was maybe the most terrible night I've ever seen.
Eventually, at 1 in the morning, the paratroopers crossed to the other side in dinghies.
The next day, Israeli forces raced across the canal to secure their bridgehead.
I was at the canal. I could see the tanks crossing and the trees on the other side.
The Israelis crossed the canal, and about 24 hours later, we got a message from Brezhnev inviting me to come to Moscow.
We thought Kissinger's visit to Moscow would be useful. He could help us stop the conflict.
We thought it would give the Israelis more time if I went to Moscow, because nothing could happen until I got there. While I was in the air, Nixon sent a message directly to Brezhnev saying that I was fully authorized to conclude, but I frankly wanted to stall.
The Soviets were in such a hurry to end the fighting that General Secretary Brezhnev led the talks with Kissinger himself.
But within hours the ceasefire broke down. The Israelis seized their chance, dashing forwards to the outskirts of Port Suez. By the 24th, they had cut the Suez to Cairo road at kilometer 101 and were only 60 miles from the Egyptian capital itself. The Battle of the Ceasefire transformed the situation. The Israeli drive had now trapped the Egyptian Third Army in Sinai, cutting all its supply lines. They now held a tremendous bargaining counter in the south. In the north, the elite Golani Brigade fought a bitter battle to recapture Mount Hermon, losing 70 men. 8 hours before the ceasefire on the 22nd, their pennant was raised alongside the Israeli flag on the summit. Now the Israeli flag flew in Africa too. As the second ceasefire came into effect, the two armies watched each other warily across the canal from reversed positions. This time, United Nations troops had been sent to enforce it and to arrange the passage of supplies through Israeli checkpoints. It was a remarkable turnaround. The initial Egyptian triumph had been cut from under them. A whole army was now dependent on Israeli goodwill in order to survive. Each side had lost territory to the other, but with the missile shield torn open and 20,000 Egyptians captive in the desert, the Israelis now held the upper hand. At kilometer 101 on the Cairo road, for the first time ever, an Egyptian delegation arrived to negotiate directly with representatives of a country whose existence it did not even recognize. No one there would have believed that such a dialogue could continue, or that within 4 years, President Sadat would stand to address the Israeli parliament, at the heart of the country he had fought so hard to destroy.
plan was conceived by Major General Ariel Sharon, who until July had been the commander of the IDF Southern Forces. Sharon's bitter infighting with his replacement, Major General Shmuel Gonen, was part of the controversy that raged in Israel after the war had ended. Sharon and General Bren Adan, the head of the IDF Armored Corps, spearheaded an assault that drove a wedge between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd Armies. On October 15th, IDF tanks crossed the canal on rafts to secure a bridgehead. Then combat engineers working under heavy fire began building a bridge across the Suez. IDF forces were attacking hard along the Egyptian line to divert fire from the crossing site. Sharon crossed on October 16th. Renadan's division followed the next day. Not all of his men made it. Egyptian shells hit the bridge and dozens of tanks toppled into the canal. But over 140 tanks had crossed, with each brigade supported by an infantry battalion. The IDF's plan was to trap the Egyptian Third Army between the Israeli forces on the east and west banks of the Suez. Thus began one of the hardest fought battles of the war. The Israelis had adapted to reality and were no longer rushing in with their tanks well ahead of infantry and air support. IDF tanks swept along the banks of the Suez and cut off the supply lines of Egypt's Third Army. But the Egyptians held their ground tenaciously.
Sunshine, who in the nighttime, who by high ordeal, who by common trial, who in your merry, merry month of May, who by very slow decay, and who shall I say is called slip, who by barbiturate, who in his realms of love, who by something blown, who by avalanche, who by powder, who for his greed, who for his hunger, and who shall I say is called and who by brave ascent, who by accident, who in solitude, who in this mirror, who by his lady's command, who by his own hand, mortal chains, who in power, and who shall I say is called shall I say is calling.
מי בכוח רב